In 1954, the United States government wrote a purchase order for 10 knives. Not 10,000, 10. 5 made from quarter-inch steel, 5 from thinner stock, so somebody could measure the difference. 2 went to the Marine Corps Equipment Board. 8 went out to squadrons, into real hands, to be used until something broke. That knife was tested. The report came back favorable, and the military never adopted it. Servicemen went out and bought it themselves anyway, out of their own pay, on top of everything the government had already handed them. That happened over and over, across 4 wars, for 80 years. So tonight's question is not which knife was deadliest. It is stranger than that. Why would a serviceman, already carrying a rifle he did not choose and a pack he did not pack, voluntarily spend his own money, add half a pound to his load, and carry a knife the military never made standard issue? Before we're through, you'll meet a knife you could not buy unless you first mailed in proof you were serving. A dagger pulled off the shelf for looking too vicious, that came back only after the factory added a saw to its spine and called it something else. A fighting knife cataloged, on purpose, under a lie, so if it turned up in the wrong place, nothing led home. And at the end, a knife with no maker, no model number and no price, because the Marine who needed it stood in Iraq and built it himself. I'm Harlan Vance. This is Lost American Arms, 15 knives American servicemen carried into war, and not one of them was standard issue. Let's start in a church basement. Number 15. The knives Hoyt Buck made in the basement of his church in Mountain Home, Idaho. When the United States entered the Second World War, it did not have enough knives. Not close. The country was equipping millions of men in months, and the plain fixed blade, for opening a crate, cutting a rope, eating a meal, was not there in the numbers required. So the government asked the American public to donate their own. Read that again. The most industrially powerful nation on earth asked ordinary citizens to take the hunting knives off the wall and mail them in, so soldiers would have something on their belts. Hoyt Buck heard that call, a blacksmith's apprentice in Kansas as a boy, and by then pastor of the local Assembly of God church. He had no knives to donate. What he said has been repeated by his family ever since. He didn't have any knives, but he sure knew how to make them. So he bought a forge, an anvil, and a grinder, and set up shop in the basement of his church. There was an air base at Mountain Home, and servicemen began walking over to ask the pastor for a knife. He made them from worn-out files, steel that had already lived a whole working life before it was reborn as a blade. And by the family's account, he was allowed into the base scrapyard, where he took lucite out of wrecked aircraft canopies and turned it into handle material. Sit with that image. A pastor in a basement, grinding a dead file into a knife, with a grip cut from the windshield of a wrecked airplane, for a 19-year-old about to leave Idaho who may not come back. By war's end, he had a waiting list of GIs. His grandson, who runs Buck Knives today, has said plainly that his grandfather made them for local servicemen for free. These were not military knives. No ordnance stamp, no contract number, no specification, because there never was one, and that is the point. The private knife did not sneak into this story later. It was there at the beginning, because the system came up short, and men filled the gap by hand. Number 14. The knives Floyd Nichols made for the draftees of his own Nebraska county. Floyd Nichols was a welder, later a sculptor, in David City, Nebraska, and a First World War veteran. When that call for knives went out, Nichols and 2 other local blacksmiths did not send anything in a box. They made a knife for every man in the county who was drafted. Every one, personally. And here is the detail that ought to stop you cold. Nichols stamped his own name and his town into the steel. Then, on the crossguard, he put the soldier's name and his service number. A saddlemaker friend named Alfred Cornish tooled the sheath, put the man's name and number on that too, and signed his own work at the top. So think about what that young man carried overseas. Not a piece of equipment, a knife with his own name on the guard, made by a neighbor, in a sheath made by another neighbor, men he could have named, and had probably eaten dinner with. If you have one, a fixed blade with a name and a service number on the guard. That is not a souvenir. And notice what these first two entries share. Nobody bought anything. The knife was a gift. That changes in a hurry. Number 13. The Ek Commando knife, and the strangest sales policy in American cutlery. John Ek had been making knives since about 1939. In January of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America was formally in the fight, he began producing them in quantity in Hamden, Connecticut. He built them for one customer, not hunters, not campers, not the public, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. That was the entire market, by design. By August of '44, demand had him running 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, on 10 patterns. He also employed disabled Americans in that shop, men who could not serve, making knives for men who could. Now here is what makes Ek different from every other name tonight. You could not simply buy one. To purchase an Ek Commando knife, you had to send in proof of military service, and when the knife was made, it was given a number, and that number went into a log, tied to the man who owned it. A private company, with no government contract requiring any of it, voluntarily built a registry connecting a specific knife to a specific serviceman, not for the Army's benefit, for his. He is not buying steel. He is buying membership in something. Ek knives were never issued. But they turned up with Marine Raiders, Army Rangers, the 1st Special Service Force, and the operational groups of the OSS. Americans have carried them in the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Afghanistan, and Iraq. 6 conflicts, never once as standard issue, not one day of it. Number 12. The Randall Model I and Model II, and letters addressed to a man with no address. Bo Randall did not set out to arm anybody. A Florida citrus man who got interested in knives in the late 30s, opened a shop in Orlando in 1938, and built hunting knives for sportsmen. That was the business. Then the war came, and by the company's own account, a young sailor asked Randall to make him a knife for close combat. That is the whole beginning. One sailor, one request. His friends saw the knife. They placed orders. Their friends placed orders. A reporter wrote a story, and Randall's telling of what happened next is one of my favorite lines in American manufacturing. Suddenly, unexpectedly, they were in the knife business. Then comes the detail I think about more than any specification tonight. Envelopes began arriving at that shop, addressed simply to Knife Man, Orlando, Florida. No street, no number, just a description of what the man did for a living, and the name of a town, and the post office found him anyway. He produced 3 patterns for those wartime customers. The Model I, all-purpose fighter. The Model II, fighting stiletto. And the Model III, hunter, which tells you something all by itself, that in the middle of a world war, his 3rd seller to servicemen was a hunting pattern. Be exact about the classification, because this is where most videos go wrong. A Randall in the Second World War was a private purchase, full stop, not issue, not unit purchase, not a test article. A man spent his own pay, waited weeks for a hand-built knife to arrive by mail, and strapped it on next to gear the Army had already given him for free. And in 1943, that was not a better weapon in any way. You could time with a stopwatch. It was a decision. In a life where a man had no say over where he slept, what he ate, or where he went, this was one object he had picked himself. That is worth a month's pay to a certain kind of man. It always has been. Number 11. The Randall Model 15 Airman, the knife the government tested, approved, and never adopted. By 1953, the Marine Corps had a problem. Its aviators had come through the Pacific and Korea, and the Corps concluded that combat flying needed a different knife, one that could get a man out of a wrecked aircraft, strong enough to pry and smash with, short enough to wear in a cockpit where every inch is spoken for. The Marine Corps Equipment Board assigned Lieutenant Colonel H. Ross Jordan and Major Harold Mahaffey to it. As documented by Randall historian Robert Gaddis, they read a magazine article in December of '53 about a knife maker in Orlando, and that February they drove down and toured his shop. By the end of the second day, February 12, 1954, Beau Randall had the basic design. 2.5 weeks later, prototypes were finished. 5.5-inch blade of 1/4-inch tool steel, held at full thickness nearly to the point so the tip would not snap under prying. A 7/8-inch tang the whole length of the grip, with an extension at the butt you could hammer with. Patent granted in May of 1956. In mid-March, he took the prototypes to Quantico, and Marine and Navy officers recommended buying 10 for evaluation. That is the requisition we opened with. And then the project died of nothing at all. Not rejection, attrition. That summer, Mahaffey was transferred to France. Jordan retired. The 2 men who cared were gone, and the file went quiet. Randall heard in December that testing had run 2 months with good feedback. The Air Force ordered some the following April. He wrote again that June. He never heard back. Not from the Marines, not from the Air Force. Ever. Here is the part it took a researcher digging through Marine Corps archives to find. There was a report, September 1955, by Major Norman Gorley, the officer who replaced Mahaffey. It was uncovered by knife historian Frank Trzaska and published in 2001. And the report was good. Extensive testing showed the 1/4-inch version, Beau's original design, suitable for aviators' survival use. It praised the design, materials, and workmanship, and suggested improvements, saw teeth, a flat hammering butt, handle variations. Randall was never told. He added most of them on his own over the next decade anyway. So why was it never adopted? Almost certainly because while all this was happening, the Navy adopted a different knife, the Imperial Pilot Survival Knife, and the Marine Corps sits under the Department of the Navy. Once the parent service has a survival knife, a Marine board buying a different one is swimming uphill. So let's be precise, because this gets inflated constantly online. The airmen did not fail testing. It was not rejected. Nobody said no. It passed, and then the paperwork stopped moving. And here is the ending. Colonel Keith McCutcheon sat on that same equipment board as chief of the air section. When testing wrapped up, he kept his 1/4-inch prototype and carried it the rest of his career. In January of 1966, commanding the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing at Da Nang, he wrote that the airman was a wonderful knife and that he had carried it 10 or 11 years. Photographs from March of 1970 show him back at Da Nang as a lieutenant general, with the knife on his hip. That is the whole thesis of this video in a single photograph. The institution moved on. The man did not. Number 10. The Randall Model 14 attack, and what "everybody wanted one" actually means. The 14 is the Randall most people picture when they picture Vietnam, which is where I need to correct the most repeated exaggeration in this whole subject. You will hear that Vietnam troops carried Randalls. Some did. Frank Trzaska, who has spent decades cataloging military knives, put it about as plainly as it can be put. The Randalls were the knives everybody wanted, but few had them. They became a status symbol of a professional. Wanted by many, owned by few. 2 completely different historical facts, and collapsing them is how a real story turns into folklore. So who actually had one? Officers and senior men with the pay for it. And sons. Veterans interviewed by Blade magazine have described the Randall as a legacy knife. Expensive, yes, but their fathers and grandfathers had carried them, so they were passed down to the sons and grandsons. Which means that for some of these men, the knife on the belt in Vietnam had already been to the Pacific. It was not bought. It was handed over, probably without much of a speech. Number 9. The MACV-SOG knife, the fighting knife cataloged as something else on purpose. In January of 1964, a joint unconventional warfare task force was created under Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. The name was deliberately dull. The Studies and Observations Group, SOG. Small teams going across borders into Laos and Cambodia on reconnaissance the United States was not publicly acknowledging. Those men needed a knife. But there was a condition no ordinary requirement has. It could not be traceable. The job landed with Conrad Benjamin Baker, Deputy Chief of the Counterinsurgency Support Office on Okinawa. Baker designed a heavy Bowie pattern, produced in Japan, contracted to makers in Seki. Because the work was subcontracted around, the finish varied. The bluing came out black on some, and blue, purple, even plum on others. And the knives carried no markings at all, no maker, no country. Sterile, the operational word for it. Here is the single best detail in this entire video. A second batch of 1,200 was contracted in October of 1966. And the official description of what the United States was buying reads, knife, indigenous, hunting, 6-inch, with black scabbard and whetstone, a fighting knife for one of the most classified units of the war, ordered under a description that makes it sound like a local hunting tool. That is not sloppiness. That is the point. If the knife turned up somewhere it should not be, there was nothing on the steel and nothing in the paperwork that led home. And this is why I keep insisting on categories. Was the SOG knife issued? Yes, to a specific unit, through unconventional channels. Was it standard issue? Absolutely not. It never appeared on a general equipment list. Most soldiers in Vietnam never saw one and had no idea it existed. Originals are rare and heavily faked today. And the name outlived the war in a way nobody planned. In the mid-80s, a designer named Spencer Fraser saw a display of these originals and named a knife company after them. A unit that was not supposed to exist, carrying a knife that was not supposed to be identifiable, and the name ended up on a sales counter. That is a very American ending. Number 8. The Gerber Mark II, the most famous knife of Vietnam that was never issued to anybody. Clarence Holzman went by Bud, a captain with the 101st Airborne in Europe in the Second World War, decorated for gallantry under fire. Afterward, he settled in Portland, Oregon and sold cars. Then, in his 60s, watching a new war on television, he designed a knife for a generation that was not his. He worked from the Fairbairn Sykes Commando dagger, the blade of his own war, and reportedly from a Roman gladius in the British Museum. He gave it a wasp waist and made the handle oval instead of round, so a man could feel which way the edges pointed without looking. He took it to Gerber Legendary Blades in May of 1966, and a prototype went to Fort Lewis that July for evaluation by soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division. And here is what everybody gets wrong. Gerber built it hoping the Army would adopt it as standard issue. The Army did not. Instead, it went onto the shelves of post exchanges, and soldiers bought it with their own money. Never issued. Sold at the PX. That is the actual classification, and it is far more interesting than the myth. The first production run had a 5-degree cant. The blade sat at a slight angle to the handle. Holzman had reasons involving how the knife rides against the body and comes to the hand. Customers hated it. Not because it performed badly, but because it looked wrong. They thought it was defective. They thought it had been bent, and they sent them back. So Gerber straightened it. Which means the canted early Mark IIs, the ones returned as broken, are the most sought-after examples today. The customer complaint became the collector's grail. What made an object unpopular in its own time is very often what makes it valuable in ours. In the 1970s, the Mark II was pulled from base distribution, not because it failed, because it looked too brutal. The mood of the country had turned, and a double-edged dagger on a shelf where families walked past had become a problem. Gerber's answer was pure American commerce. They added sawtooth serrations to the spine, stopped calling it a combat knife, and marketed it as a survival knife. And the PX system started selling it again. Same steel, same profile, same man's design, a row of teeth, and a new word on the box, and it was acceptable again. If you ever wondered why so many Mark IIs have serrations, that was not a performance upgrade. It was permission. Before we go on, we built a free field dossier for this video, the full classification table for all 15 knives, so you can see at a glance what each one actually was. Maker timelines, marking and identification notes. Variant details, a section on the claims that get repeated online and are not supported by the record, and every source, Listed. It costs nothing. The link is in the description. Now, the second half is where this story turns. Number 7. The Buck 119 Special. And a correction worth making. Remember the church basement in Idaho? This is where that story lands. After the war, Hoyt Buck moved to San Diego to join his son Al, who incorporated the company as Buck Knives in 1961. And Buck's own history traces the 119 Special, the big clip-point fixed blade you have seen 1,000 times, directly back to what Hoyt was doing in that basement for servicemen. So the 119 is, in a real lineage sense, a war knife that became a hunting knife. Exactly backwards from how these stories usually run. Now the correction. You will see the 119 described, constantly, as a Vietnam military knife, sometimes with the strong implication that it was issued. I have not found evidence supporting that. Here is what the record does support, and it is plenty. Buck fixed blades were widely available for private purchase, and veterans describing their own kit have consistently placed Buck on the PX shelf. What is not documented is a contract making it standard issue. And this distinction matters to your wallet, not just your conscience. Vietnam-era Buck, PX purchase. That is an honest and desirable description. Vietnam-issue Buck is a claim, and a claim without a document behind it is a story someone tells to raise a price. The truth about these objects is more interesting than the inflation. Every single time. Number 6. The Buck 110 Folding Hunter. The knife that beat the fighting knives at their own job. 1964. Al Buck and an engineer named Guy Hooser put a high-tension lockback into a folding knife with brass bolsters and wood scales, and it changed the category. Before the 110, if you wanted a blade you could lean on, you carried a fixed blade. After it, you did not have to. The name even went generic. People started calling any folding lockback a buck knife. And it went to war. Not issued, bought. Kim Breed spent nearly 2 decades in the Army, with the 10th and then 5th Special Forces groups, and served in the Gulf War. In his account of the knives that actually mattered on that deployment, the Buck 110 is on the list. Available at the local PX, good blade steel, easy to carry, used for assorted cutting jobs. Read that description again. Assorted cutting jobs. Not fighting. The ordinary thing. And this is the hinge of the entire video. Everything in the first half of this list was a fighting knife or a survival knife. Big, heavy, worn where everyone could see it. What actually happened over the decades is that the men carrying them figured something out. Frank Trzaska said it about as well as anyone. Young guys liked big knives, until they had to carry all that extra weight and never use it. Then the small knife was king. The longer a man carries something, the harder every ounce has to work to justify itself. And what he needs, hour by hour, is almost never what the movies show him. Opening a crate, cutting cord, getting into a case of rations, cutting a strap that has to come off right now. A sergeant major with 27 years and 14 combat deployments, Panama, Desert Storm, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, put the knife-fighting fantasy to bed in one sentence when he told Blade that using a knife in combat to stab somebody is pretty much bull, and that he had never known anybody who did it. What he called realistic was this: a helicopter crash and straps you have to cut to get a man out of the wreckage. That is what the knife is for. That is what it has always been for. Number 5. The Swiss Army knife and a pair of tweezers in Somalia. I know, after Randalls and daggers and a sterile Bowie built for cross-border reconnaissance, we have arrived at the little red one your uncle used to open his mail. Stay with me. This is not a joke. It is the proof of the thesis. Kim Breed carried a fer-de-lance strapped to his back, an aluminum-handled dagger at his side, and a Swiss Army knife. And when he was asked what that little folder was actually good for, his answer had nothing to do with the blade. It was the tweezers. In Somalia, for pulling out stickers and thorns. Sit with that. A man with 2 decades in special forces, in a place where his life could genuinely depend on his equipment, and the tool he specifically remembers being grateful for is a pair of tweezers. Because that is what field conditions actually consist of. Not one dramatic moment. 10,000 small ones. A screw backed out of a rifle. A splinter. A can that needs opening. A torn fingernail that will make the next 3 days miserable if nobody deals with it. The military issues you a weapon. It does not issue you a solution to a thorn. And that gap, between what the supply system anticipates and what a day actually contains, is the real answer to the question we opened with. Men spend their own money, not because they think they can out-equip the United States Army, but because they know something the requisition form does not. Most of a war is not a battle. Number 4. The Pacific Cutlery Fer de Lance, and a company that vanished into something bigger. The Fer de Lance was designed by David Steele and produced by Pacific Cutlery, a company that no longer exists. It is a double-edged fighter, and Kim Breed carried one almost his entire career, including into the Gulf War. His reasoning is a working man's reasoning, not a catalog's. It was light in the hand, and the blade was big enough to do the job, and because it had 2 edges, he kept one sharpened for heavy work and the other for finer work. 2 tools on 1 piece of steel, so he carried 1 knife instead of 2. He added one more observation, honest and slightly uncomfortable, and I will report it as he said it, that when he brought out a double-edged knife, local people reacted strongly, and that had an effect of its own. A knife in that context was a tool, occasionally a weapon, and sometimes a signal. All 3 are true, and sanitizing veterans' accounts does them no favors. Now the collector's payoff. Pacific Cutlery was owned and run by Les D'Assis, and when Pacific Cutlery ended, D'Assis went on to found Benchmade Knife Company. One of the largest names in American knives today grew directly out of the small, defunct outfit that made this obscure fighter. If you find a Pacific Cutlery marked knife in a box at an estate sale, you are not holding a failed brand. You are holding the seed of one. Number 3. The Cold Steel SRK, and the arrival of the rubber handle. By the late 80s and into the Gulf War, something had changed in what troops reached for, and it had almost nothing to do with blade shape. The SRK, the survival rescue knife, turns up repeatedly in veterans' accounts of that era as a favorite, and when Kim Breed explained why, he did not talk about steel or point or grind. He talked about the Creighton handle, the molded rubber. Think about that in context. For the first half of this video, every handle we discussed was stacked leather, wood, stag, tennite or micarta, beautiful, traditional, and inclined to go slick when wet and crack with weather. Molded synthetic rubber does not care. Wet, freezing, oily, gloved, it grips, it absorbs nothing. It needs no oiling. It does not come apart when it lives on a man's belt for a year, in a climate leather was never designed for. That small thing turns out to be an enormous thing, and it maps a real generational shift. The Second World War generation bought knives with beautiful handles. The generation that fought in the desert bought knives with handles they could ignore. Classification, private purchase, and PX availability, not issue. And be exact if you ever sell one. Cold steel changed production, and steels several times over the decades, and an early example is a different object from a recent one. Number 2. The Cricht M16, the PX-era knife with no romance at all. The M16 folder was designed by Kit Carson and produced by Columbia River Knife and Tool. No handmade lineage, no waiting list. Nobody wrote a song about it. An affordable production folder with a flipper so it opens with one hand, and for 2 decades it sat on the shelf of every post exchange in the system. By the company's own account, it became the knife carried by servicemen and women during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and Cricht has sent thousands of them downrange. And it was not issued. Les George, a Marine explosive ordnance disposal veteran, settled the whole question in one sentence. The CRKTs were available at the PX, and the other knives were issued to the Marines by unit. There it is, in one sentence, from a man who was standing there. 2 completely different supply chains running side by side, in the same war, for the same men. One came down through the unit, One came off a shelf and out of a wallet. 1943. A young man writes a letter, addresses it to Knife Man, Orlando, Florida, and waits weeks for a handmade knife to arrive by mail. 2004. A young man walks into a building on a base in Iraq, picks a folder off a rack, and pays for it at a register. Same instinct exactly. Completely different country. That era brought two more private choices worth naming. Multi-tools took over almost entirely. Les George carried a Leatherman wave and preferred it over the issued Gerber for a specific reason. It closed up smaller, and he could get to the blade without opening the whole tool. That is a man who has counted the seconds it takes to do a simple thing wearing gloves. And there were unit-issued folders, Benchmade strikers and Gerbers handed out by particular units, which is one more reminder of how careful you have to be with language. Unit issue is not standard issue. A knife your battalion bought is not a knife the military adopted. And that brings us to number 1. Everything tonight has been about a man choosing something off a shelf, out of a catalog, or through the mail. The space between what the government provided and what a man believed he needed. Les George served with the United States Marine Corps in Explosive Ordnance Disposal, EOD, the people who go toward the thing everyone else is running from. His work in Iraq was specific in a way no general-purpose knife anticipates. He described using a large fixed blade to probe for and dig up improvised explosive devices and unexploded ordnance, and was blunt about what that tool actually was. Brute force. The very epitome of a sharpened pry bar. He also had a small fixed blade bolted to his pistol holster, for cutting tape and preparing demolition charges. Notice what is missing there. Nothing romantic at all. No combat. A man is kneeling in the dirt. Somewhere being wrong is fatal, and he needs one thing to move earth with, and another to cut tape with, and those are two different objects. So what do you do when the catalog does not contain the thing your job requires? In his own words, he made his own EOD knife in Iraq. And here is the payoff. That knife was the first in a series that became the M12 EOD knife, which is now listed as an option that Marine Corps EOD units can purchase and use. 1943. A sailor asks a maker for a knife, and a company is born from it. 1954. The Marine Corps asks a maker for a knife, tests it, and lets it go. 1966. A maker builds one hoping the Army will take it, and the PX sells it instead. 2004. Nobody has built the right thing yet, so a Marine builds it himself. And then the design comes back around, and the Corps' own EOD people can buy it. The most revealing knife on this list was not famous when it went to war. It was not even a product yet. It existed because one serviceman had a problem, and the standard equipment did not solve it the way he wanted it solved. So, the question we opened with. Why would a man voluntarily spend his own money, add weight to a load he is already carrying, and take a knife the military never made standard issue? After 15 of these, I do not think the answer is that those knives were deadlier. Almost none of these stories are about killing anybody. They are about thorns, and straps, and crates, and cord, and a helicopter on its side, and having something in your hand that you trust because you chose it. The honest answer is closer to this. Standard equipment is designed for an army. A personal knife is chosen by one man. An army has to be equipped for the average of 1 million men. That is not a criticism. It is arithmetic, and the system does an extraordinary job of it. But nobody has ever been the average of 1 million men. The gap is exactly the size of a knife. The rifle was an obligation. Somebody handed it to him and wrote the serial number next to his name. The knife was a preference. Nobody made him buy it, and nobody would have noticed if he hadn't. In a life where nearly every decision had been taken away from him, this was one thing he got to decide. Think about where they ended up. Not in museums, mostly. In a dresser drawer in Ohio. In a toolbox in a garage in Texas. In among the sockets. On a workbench, opening paint cans for 40 years for a man who never once mentioned where it had been. Some are worth real money. A documented early Randall, a numbered wartime Ek, a canted first-run Mark II, an original SOG. Most are not, and it does not matter, because that is not what they are. The knives in this video tell you something an inventory number never can. They tell you what he thought he needed. And the difference between those two things is the whole distance between an army and a person. If there is one of these in your family, do this first. Find the sheath. Photograph the marks. And ask the oldest person still living who might know who carried it and where, because when they go, that goes with them. Tell us in the comments, what did your father or your grandfather actually choose to carry, and did he ever say why? This is Lost American Arms.